Again, my name is Miranda Murray, and I am an Indian Ed for All instructional coach here in Great Falls Public Schools. And among other duties, my work and my goals are to incorporate cultural identity for all students, and Indian Education for All is a great opportunity to be able to do so. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the hour together. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please also feel free, I'm pretty good at multitasking, so feel free if you have questions as we're going through in the chat to go ahead and ask those questions, and I will try and answer them as we are going through. So please feel free to do that. So kind of the focus of what we're going to be talking about this evening is including IFA, Indian Education for All, and culture into the classroom. And I think that the way that this applies to the work that you all are doing is giving students a sense of cultural identity, a sense of self-identity, and a sense of place in the world. So one of the things I'm asked when I'm talking about Indian Education for All is why I think it's important. And I think that it's a multiple answer question, but I think a lot of it comes down to the students and the children. So where I'm at in Great Falls, the population in our school district of Native American students is the highest urban population of Native American students in Montana. So Great Falls is the highest percentage of Native American students, with about 1,500 students in our school district being American Indian or identifying as American Indian. And so IFA, while it does say for all, is an important role in our Native American students' identity and their sense of connection to school. We know that when students have a connection to school and a connection to what they're learning or feel represented in what they're learning, that really targets our struggling students. It really targets, we've seen a lot of data support that it targets academic and behavior issues. I'll talk about that a little bit further in here. And so I think it's really important that IFA gives our Native students the opportunity to see themselves represented in the classroom, see themselves represented in the context of what we're learning, but it also opens up a lot of opportunities for all students, which is where the all comes into, to place themselves in the world. So Indian Ed for All focuses on Montana tribes. We're going to go through the essential understandings here this evening and talk a little bit about different ways you can include those essential understandings into the classroom. And when you're doing those activities, you're naturally giving students the opportunity to insert their self-identity, to insert and explore their sense of connection to themselves and to the world around them. So when our students are learning more about Montana tribes, for example, they're beginning to get a better relationship and a better understanding of the world around them and the place they live. Place-based learning is something we hear about and is an important part of students' connection to the world. So as I'm going through the essential understandings, if you would please in the chat put your name and maybe where you work or teach or what capacity you play in your job. And that will kind of help me make sure that I am doing a good job of connecting what we're talking about to maybe something a little bit more specific to you and your job. I know sometimes when I've worked with OPI in other capacities and presenting on this kind of topic, and it's really awesome to see the different groups and connections people have to IFA outside of education. Great, thank you. So we're seeing some people from all over doing a couple different things. Nice, thank you for participating in that. So essential understanding number one, if you're familiar with the essential understandings or have read through them, you'll know that they are written at a very collegiate level. And with good intention, they have a lot of important information squished into a little space. And I think that the more poignant you can be with your words, the more important that they are, and the more impact they have for others to see. But one of the things that means is that it's kind of overwhelming and hard for teachers and educators and staff to think about how to incorporate that into their classroom or into the capacity that their job has. And so when I'm talking about the essential understandings tonight, I'm going to be talking about them at their very simplest core idea. And I think that is a good way to start for people who are just getting started into the essential understandings, because if you pull them up on the OPI website and look through them, there is a lot of information packed in there. So when I'm talking about these, know that there's a lot of opportunities to go in different directions with these essential understandings. They recently, in the last couple of years, have revamped the essential understandings to include what they're calling key concepts, which just further gives teachers opportunity to decide how we can incorporate these essential understandings into our curriculum and what we're teaching. The other thing you're going to hear me say often, if you haven't participated in a presentation of mine before, is that infusing IFA into the classroom should feel very natural. It shouldn't feel like something that you are checking off once a month that you've done your IFA lesson. It should be a part of the conversation and introducing the language that you are already teaching in your classroom and in your curriculum. And when you get into the essential understandings, you'll often find there is much more connections to the things you're already teaching than you might have realized. It doesn't need to be a separate thing. And the important aspect of that is that we as teachers and educators and anyone having to do with education are overwhelmed. We have a lot to think about. We have a lot to teach. We have a lot to implement. We have a lot of curriculum to follow. And sometimes it can be daunting to think of one more thing we have to add. And so I know that I can relate to that feeling. And so when you're thinking about ways to just naturally bring in IFA concepts and ideas about culture and Montana tribes into things you're already teaching, you're just enriching the curriculum that you're already familiar with. And I feel that this is the best connection for students because it's not disjointed or it's not separated. So when we're thinking about essential understanding number one, the very basic core idea of essential understanding number one is diversity among tribes. We know that tribes are unique and distinct from one another, and it's a very important concept. It seems like a simple idea, but so often using the phrase Native Americans, Indigenous people, First Peoples, all of these phrases are lumping tribes into one group. And in some cases, that is appropriate. And in other cases, we're utilizing what is essentially pan-Indian identity. And so when we're lumping groups of people into one category, that can be problematic. So we need to understand that diversity among tribes is important. And I'm going to very quickly go into essential understanding number two, because it goes right along with that, in that essential understanding number two is talking about diversity among individuals. No two Native American people are the same. And this is important for a couple of reasons. If you're looking for resources for your classroom, for example, and you're vetting material, the number one question I get when teachers are asking me about IFA or thinking about activities to bring into their classroom or thinking about resources to bring in their classroom, they'll be like, I don't know if this is good or bad. And the real answer is all resources are good. And they might have some not so good things about them, but certainly those are teaching opportunities for our students to be critical consumers of media and literacy, critical consumers of the imagery that they're presented with. So a few things that you should know about essential understanding number one and two, because I think that they're the most poignant to vetting resources, is choosing text for your classroom, being critical readers, being critical consumers. So you should check for things like, does this promote stereotypes? If I were to read this book to my students, or if my students were to read this on their own, is this going to reinforce or introduce stereotypes to my students? Important question. Another important question is, how will this book, in the case of American Indian students, if the literacy we're vetting is about American Indian people, how will this book impact American Indian readers? It is really important to consider how this will impact self-identity. How will this impact how Native American people see themselves, how my Native American students see themselves? The second question that always goes along with that kind of self-identity question is, how will this book impact my non-Native readers? So my non-Native students in my classroom, how will this impact their view of Native students or Native people? Is this going to be a good impact? Is this going to be a negative impact? If it's a negative impact, is it something I still want to share with my students and be able to have a conversation about? So interesting questions to think about. And then the last question here is, does this text promote diversity in tribes and individuals? I think it's really important. It's a quick check when you see a book titled Native American something, Native American homes, Native American games. There is certainly resources out there that use a larger naming system like Native American, Indigenous as a larger group that are good resources. But it's always something to take pause so that when you're looking inside, is there an understanding that tribes are different, that tribes do different things, that people are different, that people do different things. For example, if you are looking through a children's book and it kind of gives the impression that all Native Americans lived in teepees, that might be something to question, because we know that not all Native Americans lived in teepees. We saw on that slide, I'll go back a couple slides, we have lots of different homes. Tribes are different based on their location because they have access to different resources. And so they would have used different things. They would have a different weather, different climate, different resources around them. And so just that simple idea is really important to understanding that tribes are diverse. The other thing that I want to say about resources, on some of these slides, I have some book titles. I can, so that you don't have to try and scramble to write down titles or authors, I can put together a list of the books I've featured in here. And I will list what essential understanding I featured them with. And I can send those to maybe Keith, and he can email those out to you so that you have that as an access and you're not worried about trying to write down those titles. All right. So when you're thinking about these questions, this is another opportunity to insert any culture. If you're looking at a book and it is talking about Asian Americans or Asian characters, you're going to want to ask yourself these similar questions. Does this book or text promote stereotypes? Will this book impact my Asian students? How will this book impact my non-Asian students and their understanding of Asian people? Is Asian the overarching theme, and therefore is it promoting diversity? And so you need to consider these kinds of questions for any type of text you're looking at that has to do with promoting diversity and connection to individuals in your classroom, or not in your classroom, learning about other individuals. Another quick checklist that I think is important when we're thinking about text and promoting that diversity is check the illustrations. Do the characters have diversity? Do the characters all look the same? What does that mean for our students to understand that there is diversity among individuals within a group? Check the storyline, check the language being used. I think that in terms of Indian education for all, like, for example, one of the things I get asked a lot is, what's an appropriate name? What should I call them? for example. So a lot of times Native people will call themselves Indian, or they'll say Indian, and some other people will be like, I thought we weren't supposed to say that. And I think because individuals are different, the answer is it's up to the individual what they'd like to be called. And so when you're looking at that kind of information, you want to check that language that's used. A lot of times phrases like American Indian, Indigenous, Native American, First Nations, those are the most commonly used phrases, I would say, that get used a lot in text. Considering historical events, we're going to talk a little bit later on about perspectives in history. So that's an important aspect. And considering that child's self-image, whether they be a part of the group that's being represented or not a part of the group that's being represented, how does that affect their self-image and their connection to the character, the culture, and the world around them? All right. If I get on a tangent and I start talking and you have questions and you need me to stop, please let me know. All right. So essential understanding number 3 is very important to the terms of IFA, for example, because the basic understanding is culture is alive and well. So often we see representations of American Indian people in the past and from a historical perspective. And so many people, because their experience maybe with Native American or the idea of Native American people is what they see in films or books or movies. And a lot of times that's represented in the past. And so, you know, if a Native American person is not walking around with braids and feathers, then someone might not know that they're Native American. And it's an interesting context and a whole separate conversation. But when we're thinking about what justice are we doing our students if we're not representing contemporary American Indian people? So the resources I have here on the side are talking about contemporary issues and talking about language and preserving culture. So powwow is an example of culture that anyone can participate in. Powwow is a celebration for everyone to come and participate in. If you have not had the opportunity to participate or watch a powwow, I suggest you try and get out this summer and do that. If we are able and in a safe position to do so, it is a really awesome opportunity to view and see culture and traditional practices and see that culture being alive and well. Some of the other resources we have on the side have to do with language and storytelling. Oral tradition is the most complex and time historically sensitive way of sharing information. So American Indian people have preserved their culture through storytelling over time. And so language is an important piece of that. So that Montana Skies series is a resource from OPI talking about traditional storytelling with the stars. They have a Crow version and a Blackfeet version. The Nemushum and His Bus is a great language book. It introduces Cree language words. And this grandpa, which Nemushum is the Cree word for grandfather, is the bus driver. And so he takes every day to teach a different word or vocabulary word in Cree to the kids on his bus. And so this story kind of follows that. And it's a very cute book. We Are Water Protectors is a great example of contemporary American Indian people being represented in a children's book. It's talking about the sacredness of water. It uses a storytelling and kind of music-like rhythm to tell the story about protecting water and being stewards of the land. So essential understanding 3, knowing that culture is alive and well and being able to represent that. So one of the ways that we share with students the culture is alive and well is we talk about everyone's individual culture. So this is another opportunity where students can express themselves, insert their identity, whether they be Native or non-Native. Everyone's getting an opportunity to express their individual identity and connect to the learning in that way. So culture is like a tree. Before I get into explaining this, I would like you, if you would please be willing to share in the chat, to connect how you think culture is like a tree. There's no wrong answers. I appreciate all participation. So if you wouldn't mind responding in the chat, how is culture like a tree? We'll give everyone a little bit of time to do that. Great, some great connections coming through. Thinking about maybe we only see what's on the surface, that the tree roots are important to nourish the tree, very important. There are parts you see and parts you don't see. They contribute to a whole. Great. Yeah, those are excellent connections. I love posing this question to students because they often come up with far more poetic connections to what this analogy could be like. How is culture like a tree? So yeah, branches come from the same trunk, roots maybe having to do with your birth and your grounding, and root system is important to the strength of the tree. Yeah. When a tree passes, it gives back and helps feed new trees. Excellent. Thank you so much for participating in the chat. So when you hear about culture, formally and more often it used to be referred to as culture as like an iceberg. And that really referred to the part you could see on the top and the part you couldn't see on the bottom. And we have changed to using culture as like a tree. It's a more indigenous view of culture, I think, and it gives you more opportunity for layering how complex culture can be. And this is a good opportunity because I think a lot of times, not necessarily just students, but people in general feel that they might not have a culture. And everyone has a culture. It just might look different for everyone. So not everyone's culture may have ceremonies or practices that maybe we're familiar with, for example, like with American Indian people. But everyone has layers to themselves and experiences and histories that make up who they are today. And that's an important part of culture. So you're exactly right in saying that culture is things that we can see, things that we can't see. So if we're thinking of a tree and we think of the leaves as being the most predominantly visible part of the tree, that is the part of culture we can see. That is the part of a person's identity that you don't even have to have a relationship with that person. You can just see. You can see their physical traits. You can see the different aspects of how they interact with people around them, their age maybe, other physical qualities that make them different from other people. So that is the much more visible part of our culture, those things we can see, clothing, those kinds of things. Then you move inward a layer and you have the branches. And the branches are things that are still visible, but less visible. This might be things you know about your coworkers or about some of your students. It requires a little bit of conversation to learn more about these things. So I'm thinking of things like personality traits, how people interact, going just a little bit deeper, those family values, roles in a family, the role a person plays in their family is an important part of their culture. Then we have the trunk, and this is even less visible, but depending on the tree, I guess on this tree it's pretty visible, but you're getting further down into the system. And this has more to do with practices and ceremonies and personal belief systems, religion, holidays celebrated, those kinds of things. So we're getting a little bit further into the system. And then even further below is the root system. And you might never know this about a person. These are things that unless a person specifically shares these about themselves with you, you would never know. So it has to do with life experiences. So I'm thinking in terms of our students, even ACEs, their trauma experiences. It has to do with their family background, how their family system and expectations work, their belief system, their sense of self. So we're getting into lots of layers. One of the ways that you can use this in your classroom with students is to have them fill out their culture tree. Now, depending on your relationship with your students, I would exclude the root system, unless you word it in such a way where they're choosing things that they're comfortable sharing. I would focus on the tree parts that are above ground. You can talk about the root system and what that might entail for someone in their identity, but I would maybe steer clear of having students having to write things down or fill those things out, for example. So I will go to my next slide and show you an example. So I filled this out about myself. So I'm thinking about, I have a planning sheet here, and I can give students the opportunity to write 3 to 5 things about themselves for each of these sections. This root system, I've worded in such a way that they can feel comfortable maybe sharing these things. So an important life event might be something that, kids might say, high school kids might say, I got my driver's license, or things like that. They can share about their families and their ancestors. They can share a hidden talent. In the trunks, we have talents and skills, traditions, preferences. So I've gone through and filled this out about myself. And then I can take this and use this for an assignment. Maybe I have students write about themselves in a poem format, or maybe I have students do an art project where they make a tree and they utilize these words as part of their tree. This is a new and different way for you to maybe revamp an I am poem. We're all familiar with those being used over and over again. But it is important to be able to do these kinds of activities with your students so that you can get to know them. And even if they have the opportunity to share with each other, they can get to know each other better. You're inserting a sense of identity. It's giving all students that sense of representation and showing that their culture is alive and well because they are here and this is their culture, what they're filling out about themselves. Okay, just wanted to check the chat, make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, so moving on, stop me if you have any questions. We have essential understanding number 4. And essential understanding number 4 has to do with the formation of reservations. And you can take this essential understanding a couple of different ways. You can talk about the reservation system. You can talk about how reservations came to be through treaties or executive order are the main ways that the Montana tribes and their reservations came to be. Or you can talk about place. And I think place is a really important part of identity, how you feel connected to the land. OPI has a lot of great resources on place and a lot of great lessons to be able to utilize a sense of place as a part of a way of teaching. But I want you to think about reservations, and I know we're kind of breezing through. An hour is not a long time to talk about all of these essential understandings, but I did want to give you a brief overview. I want you to think about what that reservation system looked like, what that means. If you're not familiar, reservations were, if you look at this map here with the state of Montana with the large colorful areas and the smaller red areas, the large colorful areas were the first establishment of kind of a treaty that said if you stay in these traditional areas and allow safe passage for the non-native people to just be coming through, because we promise they're just coming through, they're not here to stay, then, you know, we'll do these things for you in exchange. And so those large colorful areas are kind of some of those traditional lands for a lot of our Montana tribes. And then they were over time ceded down to these red areas. These red areas represent our current reservations. So I'm going to start a new share so I can show you a couple of resources online that you can use to talk about the reservation systems. So the first thing we have is this native land website. Again, I will put this in the resource document that I send out so that, or that I send to Keith to send out so that you can have this. So make sure that you email Keith if that is something you're interested in having for that resource list. This native lands website does its very best attempt. I think a warning comes up when you come to this page saying that they can't vouch that everything is perfectly accurate. And I think that's a great warning to have system to have up. It is kind of funny because like in Montana, like in Great Falls, for example, if you were to ask the Crow people, they would say that Great Falls area is part of their traditional lands. And if you were to ask Blackfeet people, they would say that Great Falls is a part of their traditional lands. And that has to do with Native American people being migratory and moving around during different seasons of the year to the different things they need with their scientific knowledge. So having kind of shared this area, so there's a lot of overlap. This map is interactive. You can kind of move over, you'll see the different areas. It uses traditional names as best as it can. You can toggle these areas at the top to look at territories. I'll undo it and do languages. So this is showing you where these languages were spoken and the diversity in the languages that were once spoken. A lot of our languages have diminished, but there are a lot of amazing programs out there to preserve tribal language. That is really cool that's happening. All of our Montana tribes have language apps or language resources. So if that's something you're interested in, you should really check that out. You can go into the App Store and search our Montana tribes names and find those vocabulary apps. And those are really cool. You can toggle this also to look at treaties and how those treaties have changed over time. You'll notice a lot of these are named cessions. So ceding the land and how those secessions changed over time. So this is a great resource to be able to use. Move I can just barely see this tab. This other website is called Invasion of America, and you can look through and find different places and interact with how tribal territories have changed and what reservations look like over time. So you'll see like all of this red area in Montana was at one time reservation, so to speak, and so how that has diminished or changed. And then lastly, I'd like to share this short little video with you. I will play it on my screen. Let me make sure I have my to ask. But if you watch this video, maybe I can just play it on the smaller part. Yeah, I can. Okay. It's just a short video, and what it's going to do, it's going to take us through an interactive map, and it's going to play land reservation area over time. So it's going to go really quickly. I want you to pay attention. This is a video, if I were watching with students, I would watch it multiple times. I would stop and check for questions and understanding in between. But you're going to see a lot of land disappear really quickly. So again, if I were watching this with students, I would watch through that several times, and in between I would say, so after the first time watching through, I might say, what did you notice? And so go ahead in the chat and respond. What did you notice the first time watching that through? That was funny. I don't know if any of you caught that I just was kicked out of Zoom and it let me right back in. All right. So the reservations were originally set up and decreased dramatically. That's a great observation. So you'll have seen a lot of those red areas started out quite large and then just boop, they were suddenly really small, especially in Montana. You might go back and notice and find opportunities to teach specific things about what's going on during the years, if you can pause and see what's happening, because you'll see suddenly California is like gone. What's going on during that time in California? We have the gold rush. So you'll see a lot of expansion from the east, and then kind of suddenly on the west coast, there's some things happening, and then it moves through the middle because the perceived important resources are kind of on those coasts, and then we have expansion happening. So very interesting to talk about, very interesting to put students into that perspective. I like to, when the opportunity arises, to put students in feelings of empathy. So, for example, and you can respond in the chat to this. We have a new family along with the police come to your home. Let me move this out of the way so I can read it. Come to your home and tell your family, we live here now and you'll have to leave. You do not have a choice because the police are there to enforce your leaving, and you can only take what you can carry, and your family has lived in this house for generations. So in the chat, thinking about this happening to you, you're in your home and the police and a new family come and kick you out. You don't have a choice. How do you feel? How do you respond? What's not okay about this scenario? So if you were to think about this, a lot of times students are like, well, I would fight back. I would do something about it. And then we can talk to them about it's hard to, in that situation, you have to think about your family's safety. And if fighting back in that moment isn't the safest thing for your family, you might not have the opportunity to do that. So yeah, you would have feelings of violation. You'd be angry. You would feel like your family doesn't matter, or that they're not being seen as maybe humans. That connection to each other. If one group has dominance over the other, somehow there's this there's a power dynamic, and then that gives us a sense of othering and putting people in a less than position. Awesome. Thank you for your participation. Okay, and then we went through that map. So essential understanding number 5 is federal policy. 5, federal policy. This is something that encompasses all of the essential understandings because there's federal policy in all of them. But American Indian people are the most regulated group of people in the history of the United States. Since 1492, American Indian people have been affected by federal policy in one way or another. And so we have things like there's, I'll just go to the next slide so you can see this. we have the federal policy or the time eras that historians kind of break down American Indian people into these federal policy eras. And I have added a little bit to this timeline. I think when you're looking at the essential understandings, it's often listed in this format of list format with years. And that's hard for students to visualize or have like a concrete understanding of what that means. And so we have these time periods. We've added time immemorial because often we refer to the Americas and we refer to things from Columbus on, and we don't really talk about what was happening here before Columbus. I saw a reference the other day to a news anchor on a news channel that had referenced that there wasn't anything going on here prior to colonization. And it's an interesting comment to make, because if there was nothing going on prior to colonization, what was there to colonize, right? The action of colonization implies that there was something there to colonize in the first place. Just an interesting concept about time. So we have the colonization period that begins in 1492. We argue that that is ongoing as long as America functions the way it functions. Colonization is still here. We have the treaty period, which was kind of short-lived in terms of history, because the American government realized pretty quickly we got to get out of the Indian business, is what they're quoted to have said. And so we have the treaty period, which relates to sovereignty, we'll talk about in just a moment. And we have the assimilation period. This begins with boarding schools and allotment and any laws that were put in place or policies that were put in place to make the American Indian people act like or conduct business the way that the larger dominant group wanted it to be conducted. So education was happening before boarding schools for American Indian children for thousands of years prior, but boarding schools were the way that the American government felt that Native children needed to be educated. It was also the time in which, in the example of Carlisle's boarding school, the first boarding school, they wanted to kill the Indian and save the man. And so that sense of identity and that sense of generational trauma, I would say, in terms of education that we see with our families is very present. The last boarding schools of their kind kind of closing in the 70s. That's not very far away. It feels far away to our kids. They think that the 70s means a long time ago. But for them to put into context that parents and grandparents were definitely alive during the time of the last boarding schools, that's a interesting pill to swallow when they get to learn more about that. We have the Reorganization Act, which the government was for a little bit kind of like, hey, let's actually give some power back to the tribes, as their treaties say that they should, and reorganize the tribes, but still with that paternalistic view of you can have some control and power back, but it needs to look like our government. You need to have a constitution, and you need to have a tribal government that's organized like the American government. And then this pendulum swing, as all federal laws are, educational laws are. We always have, with new leadership, we go in a different direction. So we have a lot of back and forth with these ideas. So then after reorganization, we have termination, which is the attempt to terminate treaties and to no longer honor the treaties that were set up with tribes. And then the period that we are in now is self-determination. This was started with the Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act of 1975, and that is giving power back to American Indian tribes and reservation systems to have their sovereignty the way that it was intended. So we'll come back to that idea of sovereignty, but federal policy can really be kind of weaved in and tied into a lot of different things. It's a huge, big idea and concept. It's hard to narrow down to a couple of minutes, but if you take anything away from looking at this timeline, I want you to know that American Indian people are the most federally regulated people of all time. That sounds like an award. It's not. And that just like we experience in education and other laws, there's a pendulum swing of this kind of back and forth and overlapping. And when you have overlapping of laws that contradict each other, that leads to a lot of turmoil. So when we get asked, like, why don't reservation systems seem to have it together a little bit more? Well, it's hard to play the game when the rules keep changing. And that is definitely what we see in the way that the federal government kind of runs things. And so I'll go to these next slides so that I can kind of elaborate on that. Essential understanding number 6 is that history often conflicts with the perspectives of all parties involved. So what that means is one group generally has the benefit of telling the story and writing the history books, while other groups involved don't have their side of the story told. So when you're thinking about essential understanding number 6, you are incorporating essential understanding number 6 if you are providing varied perspectives. And I think it's a really awesome opportunity for students to kind of be critical thinkers and be presented information, maybe whatever is in your history book or your textbook, and then you provide other primary source documents or firsthand accounts of the same events. Students can be like, wait a second, there's more to the story here, and make their own conclusions about history, because history is subjective. There's a lot of wiggle room in there, and including varied voices is a very important part of that essential understanding. I'm going to skip that part and go to essential understanding number 7 is sovereignty, the inherent right to be in control of oneself. So we have 12 tribes in the state of Montana. We have 8 tribal headquarters, I would say. That's kind of hard to, before Little Shell were recognized, we used to say we have 7 reservations and 1 tribal headquarters. Now we just refer to them as 8 tribal headquarters. So we have 7 reservations, and the Little Shell have their tribal headquarters located here in Great Falls. All of our 12 tribes are now federally recognized, which is an important step in history for our state. And when you're thinking about sovereignty, I think it's an important part of the conversation, because sovereignty is a unique and distinct right of tribes, and that has to do with those treaties. So the United States government doesn't make treaties with individuals or groups within their own bounds. They make treaties with sovereign groups. So other countries, for example, and tribes are example of sovereign groups in charge of themselves. Now, it is true to say that sovereignty looks a little bit different for our tribes than it would for, say, a separate country. But upholding those treaties and recognizing sovereignty is a very important part of the cultural identity. And all of our essential understandings leading up to this point play a part in sovereignty. And so just so you can have kind of an understanding about, and this kind of ties into what I was just saying with the federal policies, just so you can have an understanding about how complicated that sovereignty can be, is this is a very abbreviated list of what tribal governments have to deal with. So we have the federal level. Ultimately, the federal government has jurisdiction within reservation bounds. We have the state and local level, and then we have the tribal level of government. And so when you're looking at these lists, certainly not the whole list, but when you're looking at these lists, you can understand that the amount of bureaucracy and paperwork and holes to jump through and things to do to be able to play the game, as I said earlier, become very complicated. Tribal jurisdiction is a very complicated issue because we know that treaties, we're not all the same. Each individual tribe may have their own treaties. Some tribes were kind of put together on the same treaties, so their circumstances might be similar. But this makes for a very complicated system for our American Indian tribes to be able to be doing things at the level that they want to be. So for example, if you're an individual on the reservation and you want to start a business, there is about 40 more steps involved in starting a business on the reservation than there would be off reservation. So just putting those obstacles and barriers in place for American Indian people on many things, not just for starting a business, make it really hard to have that sovereignty that is promised in those treaties. Other countries are often looking at how we are treating our tribes because they have concerns in foreign policy about those treaties that they have with the United States government. If France can't trust that we are going to uphold our end of the deal when we make a treaty, because they're kind of looking to see how we're doing with our treaties within our own government system with tribes, like, you're not even doing that at home. What makes you think that I should trust you to do that out here in this part of the world? So just some interesting concepts there. So what I'd like to do with these last 6 minutes, I want to be equitable with your time, is just kind of end with any questions that you might have. I will open the chat up so that I can see any questions. And just to reiterate that IFA is a great portal to give all of your students the opportunity to have that connection to identity and have that connection to the world around them. And when we see students have a better sense of identity, we see that those struggling students are improving. We see that their academic and behavior issues are improving. I'll just talk briefly, unless a question comes up in the chat, about a project we're working on here in Great Falls Public Schools. Is our Indian Education Department, which IFA and Indian Ed Title VI, we work side by side because we're headed for the same goals. They have started a culture group at several, I think we did it at two schools last year, and the data was so impressive and awesome that we started it at 5 schools this year and hope to build on that. And what they did is they took 10 kind of intensive students at that building, American Indian students, that were either having behavior issues or attendance issues or academic issues, or maybe all of the above. And we took 45-minute sessions every other week and taught them a very important part of their culture. So the first one, for example, we learned about smudge, and they learned about the sacred plants and why we smudge and how to smudge. And then some of them, we've talked about the medicine wheel and balance, and they got to make a medicine wheel medallion, a faux medallion. And Michelle, I'll look into if that's data that we can share. I think it probably is. For we're collecting the final data for this year for the 5 schools we're doing it at, but for the 2 schools we did it at last year, my director and I are presenting this at NIEA in the fall. So certainly I'm sure I could share that with you guys. The attendance rate, we shared with the students that they could only continue to come to these special culture clubs if they were coming to school. And the attendance rate went up. Attendance is really the answer to everything, isn't it? Because in turn, their grades went up. Their grade point average as a group went up. Their behavior issues went significantly down. We tracked that through referrals. And we got amazing feedback from teachers about you know, this student came back from your culture club and shared with the class what they learned, and I've never had that student talk in class before. So just those kinds of things. And so on a broader scale, we've kind of married that cultural identity that we're using in our Title VI program with our EVA program, and seeing how cultural identity for all students, or a sense of self-identity, a positive sense of self-identity, has been really an important part of seeing that improvement in academic and behavior issues for our students. So with that, if there aren't any more questions, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being able to present with you today. And if you have any questions that you think of, I'll put my email address in the chat. It's a long one because it's a school district one. Miranda Murray at gfps.k12.mt.us. You can also look my email address up on our school district website, but I will be sending that resource list to Keith so that you guys can all have that as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Miranda. And I put my email too in the chat. So if anybody has any questions, just fire off an email. And then as soon as I get that information too from Miranda, I'll share that to anyone who wants that list of books that align with the essential understanding. So that was amazing. Thank you very much, Miranda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And I also put in the chat, if you want to receive the renewal unit, you just need to put your name and then what school you're associated with, and then I can get those renewal units out to you as soon as we get those released. So I sure appreciate you very much, Miranda, for coming on and sharing with us your wealth of knowledge. Thank you very much. This will be our last community of practice until next fall, and we'll probably open that up in September of next year. So be watching for our announcements for our community of practice, which will start back up next fall. Thank you so much, Miranda. No more questions, and then we'll go ahead and end. Everyone have a great summer.